what ways did Deutsche Bank enable the rise of Donald Trump? David Enrich will be here to discuss his book, Dark Towers. Did you know that in 17th century Norway, 91 people were put to death in a series of witch trials? Kiran Millwood Hargrave will be here to talk about the basis of her new novel, The Mercies. Plus, our critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. It's February 28th, and this is the Book Review Podcast for the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. David Enrich joins us now. His new book is called Dark Towers, Deutsche Bank, Donald Trump, and an Epic Tale of Destruction. It debuts this week at number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list. And I also have to disclose that David is my cousin-in-law, and he eats all the pie at Thanksgiving. But he is nonetheless welcome here on the podcast.
That
David.
is a low blow. I didn't know we were going to get that personal that quickly.
Yeah, it's important for people to know.
Okay.
David, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we're not going to talk about that crime. We're going to talk about some other ones. This is a book about Deutsche Bank. It started off with reporting that you did beginning in around 2014.
I was in London working at the time at the Wall Street Journal, and I'd already been kind of obsessing about Deutsche Bank because this is, it's one of the biggest banks in the world, one of the most troubled institutions, and involved is either at or near the center of just about every financial scandal under the sun. And then in January 2014, one of the most senior executives at the bank and kind of the right-hand man to the CEO at the time was found hanging in his apartment in London.
And who is he?
His name is Bill Brokesmith, and he was a guy who had worked at the bank on and off for almost 20 years. And he was an expert in risk management and an expert in derivatives, but more important, he was the guy who everyone turned to as kind of the ethical compass of the bank. He was known informally as the conscience of the place. He was someone who could say no. He was pretty conservative, and he was not quite as hungry for short-term profits as most of his colleagues were. And
did something that happened at the bank immediately precede his suicide? And did he leave a suicide note? Do we know that this was tied to his work?
Well, it's really hard and I think probably dangerous to try to make black and white statements about why someone does something like this. But yeah, he did leave a bunch of suicide notes, including one to his longtime colleague, Anshu Jain, who at the time was the co-CEO of the bank. And so one thing that became clear over the years of reporting I did and working to talk to as many friends and family members and former colleagues as I could was that there's no doubt that at the time of his death, Deutsche Bank was very much on his mind, and it was on his mind not in a good way. He was very upset about some of the things that had transpired while he was there.
All right, before we get into some of the things that he personally saw during the early 21st century, you say that as of 2014, it was well established that Deutsche Bank was a kind of troubled, scandal-ridden institution. How far does that date back?
Well, the bank is 150 years old this year. Happy birthday, Deutsche Bank. And for the first several decades of its existence, this was just a pretty provincial German and European lender helping big industrial companies like Siemens spread their wings internationally. But when the Nazis came to power in Germany in the 30s, Deutsche Bank became a central part of their attempt to take over the world. And this is a bank.
The Nazi attempt to take over the world.
attempt to take over the world.
And was that different from what other German banking institutions did at the time?
Well, Deutsche Bank was by far the biggest German bank. A lot of German companies, to survive, did what it took to survive in that era, which was helping the Nazis. But there's been an attempt by the bank and some historians, I think, in recent decades to kind of sanitize that basic fact by saying, well, everyone was doing it, and that was just kind of the way the world worked. And we can look back at this period now and say that Deutsche Bank was party to genocide.
Wow. Most people who don't work in finance and don't report on finance look at these banks. They all kind of seem interchangeable and interchangeably bad, that every one of them or many of them have had one terrible scandal or another or many in recent years. Is Deutsche Bank especially bad? Is there something about its culture?
I think there are a lot of things that make it especially bad. First of all, while it's true that just about every bank under the sun has been attached to one or more financial scandals over the years, Deutsche Bank really has been involved in a disproportionate number, and it's faced, I think, disproportionate penalties as a result of that. And you can look at that in terms of the number of criminal charges the bank has faced around the world or the amount in fines that it's racked up. But to me, the better measure of its destructive capacity is the havoc it's wreaked around the world. And you can really look probably in almost every continent of the world and see some major and pretty bad scandal that the bank was involved with that caused real harm, whether it's destroying companies or really messing up economies or being involved in major bribery or corruption scandals, laundering money, violating sanctions. Deutsche Bank is blamed by the families of some American soldiers for their deaths in Iraq because the bank was illegally funding Iranian terrorists. So you can say that about some banks, but you can't say about every bank that every single scandal comes right back to their doorstep. And that, unfortunately, is the case a lot of the time with Deutsche Bank.
Well, one of the things that differentiates Deutsche Bank from many other banks is that there is no villain at the top. They have no CEO, unlike many other banks. Is that part of the problem, that there isn't one person who is held accountable?
Well, it actually used to be that way. These days, for the past 15 years or so, they have had a CEO. And in fact, you can trace the bank's last series of problems going back to the mid-2000s to the decision to place increasing power in this unitary CEO.
So it's gotten worse when they've had someone…
Yeah, although it got worse under Joe Ackerman, who was the longtime CEO from 2002 to 2012. And he was the one who converted the organizational structure of the bank from being this kind of collaborative committee-led approach to being one where there's an American-style CEO at the top of the bank. And Ackerman, very shortly upon arriving as CEO of the bank, made a very fateful decision, which was that he decided that within a very short period of time, a couple of years, Deutsche Bank's profits needed to go up about 500%. And looking backwards, it doesn't seem that surprising, the consequences that followed. But at the time, this marked a really transformational change within the bank. And it went from being an institution that looked around and kind of saw itself as serving multiple constituencies, whether it was shareholders or customers or employees or the communities in which it operated. And it went from doing that to having a single-minded focus, an obsession on maximizing short-term profits, basically consequences be damned.
And when you talk about the recent crimes of Deutsche Bank, and we're not even getting to Donald Trump, who is in your subtitle, we'll get to him later, did most of those things, manipulating markets, helping terrorist regimes, defrauding regulators, did most of those take place during that 2002 to 2012 period when he was the CEO? Well,
they got started then. And that was Ackerman's decision to prioritize short-term profits above all else was the catalyst for all sorts of bad behavior within the bank. And it wasn't just that people were rushing to make money at any cost, and although they were doing that. It was also that the bank at that moment, because it was so obsessed with meeting quarterly profit targets, it stopped investing in things that cost money. For example, they stopped investing in technology. And so the bank's internal computer systems became just this archaic, jumbled mess. And that sounds kind of technical and maybe not that important, but the reality is it meant that Deutsche Bank, if you were asked to say, Deutsche Bank, how much money have you lent to, say, Russia? There's no easy way to answer that. You couldn't just type it into a computer because none of these computer systems were talking to each other. And that's a pretty scary thing for a bank. And they also completely failed to invest in compliance and anti-money laundering staff. And because those are things that cost money, they're not going to produce revenue. And in fact, they do the opposite of producing revenue. They take away revenue because their job, if they're doing it properly, is to say no to potentially problematic and potentially very lucrative transactions.
This focus on quarterly profits and profit above all else, is that very different from what other banks were doing during this period?
Deutsche Bank went from being this, as I said, kind of a provincial, very conservative European lender to all of a sudden, more or less in a heartbeat, becoming this profit-obsessed machine. And I think the speed of that change and the starkness of the reversal meant that the bad behavior increased at a faster rate than it probably did at other banks. And look, companies in general do try to maximize their profits, but they also, and especially historically, have looked at their goals and their mission as much broader than simply doing that, especially just doing that in the short term. And they exist to serve a wide range of people and institutions and communities. And when they are single-mindedly focused on just making as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, the consequences tend to be disastrous.
All right. The subtitle of your book, Dark Towers, is Deutsche Bank, Donald Trump, and an Epic Trail of Destruction. I want to get to Donald Trump, but really go back to that epic trail that preceded him and that overlapped with the relationship between Deutsche Bank and Trump. Let's talk about a few of them. You mentioned money laundering for Russian oligarchs.
Yeah, this is a great business for Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank has been in Russia on and off since the late 1800s. The bank financed railroads for the Tsar. And they've taken great pride on being one of the few Western banks to operate more or less without interruption in Russia. And so they provide the services that are needed at the time to the people who are in power. And by the mid-2000s, the services that were most needed by this new class of oligarchs and people connected to the Kremlin were essentially money laundering services. These people had come upon huge amounts of money in a very short period of time, often through illicit means. And they needed to find a way to get that money out of Russia. And there just weren't very many banks that were willing to provide that service because it was clear that this was ill-gotten money and that they were using it at times for nefarious purposes. So Deutsche Bank, and this becomes a real pattern for the bank, rushed in to fill the void when other banks wouldn't touch these customers and wouldn't provide the services they wanted. Deutsche Bank was incredibly eager to pick up the scraps and provide the services, even at the cost of violating the law. And so they did, and it became an enormously lucrative scheme for Deutsche Bank. They laundered well over $10 billion over a period of several years for wealthy Russians, including some tied to the Kremlin and some tied directly to Vladimir Putin.
They weren't exactly doing this out in the open. How did the relationship with these Russian oligarchs and this money laundering, how did this get uncovered?
Well, it got uncovered ultimately because some banks that Deutsche Bank was helping funnel money to got suspicious. And they saw that these enormous amounts of money all of a sudden were coming through Deutsche Bank's U.S. arm and being sent to these banks in Cyprus. And the Cypriot banks, which, by the way, don't have a reputation for being very conservative when it comes to money laundering, saw these huge amounts of money and became very suspicious. And they started asking questions. And Deutsche Bank, as is its wont to do, just completely ignored these requests for information. And the Cypriot bank got more and more aggressive. And finally, after many months of this, Deutsche Bank's compliance people realized what was going on. And there had been this massive $10 billion money laundering scheme going on right underneath their noses. And eventually regulators were alerted, and eventually the bank got in serious trouble for this.
Who are the regulators that are supposed to be keeping watch over this? Because with international finance, it becomes very convoluted. I don't think the regulation is happening in Russia. Is it supposed to be happening in Germany? Are there international bodies that are supposed to be keeping an eye on all of this?
It actually isn't that complicated. In the countries in which a bank operates, they are supposed to be regulated locally. And it becomes a little complicated in terms of who is responsible for exactly what. But this wouldn't have been that hard to police Deutsche Bank effectively. The reality is that regulators, especially in the U.S. and in Germany, just for one reason or another turned a blind eye to what was going on. And I think part of that is that in Germany, at least, there was an eagerness to kind of protect the hometown bank and circle the wagons against what were perceived as overzealous regulators in other parts of the world. And in the U.S., there is this long-hold and I think very destructive assumption among regulators that their first job is to do no harm. And so the last thing they want to do is publicly raise the alarm bells about a major financial institution. And the motivation there is, I understand, they don't want to destabilize banks by saying troubling things in public. But the implications of this in reality turn out to be that they're essentially keeping things buried. And that's not a good role for regulators to be playing.
I mean, because it's one thing to say, well, that happened in Russia, but there are people who Deutsche Bank dealt with in the U.S. who were also kind of dubious figures. One of them was Jeffrey Epstein.
This is kind of just surreal for me because I had been talking to compliance officers down in Florida where Deutsche Bank has this huge compliance staff. And I was down there talking to one of them in particular who mentioned, and this was back early last year in early 2019, and she just mentioned, she was kind of ticking off this list of sketchy things Deutsche Bank had done. And one of them, she said, was like, they even did business with Jeffrey Epstein. And that was the first I heard about it. And Epstein at the time this is before he was arrested and criminally charged over the summer. And I heard about this, and it didn't fully register until months later. But it turned out upon further investigation that Jeffrey Epstein, after he was convicted of sex crimes in 2008 and after he was booted out of the banking industry by banks like J.P. Morgan, Deutsche Bank became his lender of last resort. And up until the time that he was arrested, basically, the bank continued to lend him money and continued to provide him other financial services that were really, really important to him.
They also had a relationship with the Kushner family, Jared Kushner's father, who also was convicted. Right. Did that financial relationship with the Kushner family precede his arrest, or was that subsequent?
No, it was subsequent, and it came at a time when Jared Kushner was taking over his father's empire, and his father, of course, had been convicted of felonies, and that made him, Charlie Kushner, basically off limits to most of the banking world because most banks have concerns about doing business with people like that. And so Jared Kushner took the reins of the family business for a while, and he struck up a relationship with a woman named Rosemary Vrablic, who became a senior banker at Deutsche Bank. And Deutsche Bank became this financial lifeline for the Kushners personally and for their business as well.
So there's a through line here, Deutsche Bank helping out, establishing relationships with, lending money to people and organizations that no one else wants to touch. Russian oligarchs, the Kushners, Jeffrey Epstein, also terrorist regimes.
Deutsche Bank goes where no other bank will go, and that's not a coincidence. This is by design. Deutsche Bank was trying to make a name for itself and maximize profits as quickly as possible. And this is a German bank. Most people can't even pronounce its name properly. And how do you make a name for yourself? How do you gain a foothold in a place like the United States? And the answer is you need to go for clients that are not already banked by mainstream financial institutions.
But that's going to help you? I mean, you can't really publicize that you're doing that work, right?
Well, in fact, they did publicize it. And with Trump at least, they made quite a show out of the fact that they were the main bank to this, at the time, celebrity reality TV guy. But in general, and it wasn't only about making a name for themselves. It was also that they needed clients. They needed big, lucrative clients that were going to do a lot of business. And the most established businesses and business families and, people with a lot of money, they were already being banked by mainstream, well-established institutions. So Deutsche Bank wasn't going to be able to compete for clients like that. It needed to go pick up one executive described it to me is they needed to go pick up the scraps on Wall Street.
Sort of a bottom feeder of banks. So, okay, let's talk about Donald Trump because he was not a Russian oligarch. He was not a terrorist regime, but he did have a number of very high-profile bankruptcies and business failures. So when did his relationship with Deutsche Bank begin, and what kind of financial shape was he in at the time?
He went to Deutsche Bank for the first time in the late 1990s. And at the time, this is already a period when he was off limits to Wall Street. He had defaulted a number of times on loans and debt with his casinos in Atlantic City primarily. And the way it works in the banking industry is not that surprising. If you default on your loans, especially if you do it over and over again, that does not make you an attractive client to lend money to because you're likely to default. And so he was off limits for most of Wall Street. Deutsche Bank came along, and at this point, this is really the start of their push into the United States market in a big way. And they were just happy to do business with anyone who was willing to throw business their way. And Donald Trump came knocking, and he needed hundreds of millions of dollars to renovate and build big skyscrapers in Manhattan. And that was something Deutsche Bank was willing to do. And you know what? Initially, it worked out pretty well for Deutsche Bank because Trump was so desperate to build and maintain relationships with this major financial institution that he paid them back.
How long did that last?
Not long. So by the early 2000s, Deutsche Bank did a big bond offering on behalf of one of his companies. And Trump, within months of the bond offering being completed, defaults on the debt. And that was the end of his relationship with his one wing of Deutsche Bank. Their clients had gotten burned because they just sold them these bonds that defaulted. But in classic Deutsche Bank fashion, that is not the end of the story for the entire bank. And within a year or two, another wing of the bank is back knocking on Trump's door. And
so they're going to Trump.
In fairness, it's both. It's going in both directions. These different divisions of the bank are not really communicating with each other very well. And frankly, they're in competition with each other. There is a lot of internal rivalries and kind of factions inside the bank.
Is that typical for a bank of this size?
Yeah, it's typical, but not to the degree that it was true at Deutsche Bank. I've heard some crazy stories about the just extreme lengths rival executives would go to undermine each other within the bank, whether that was leaking personal items about them to the New York tabloids or, hiring private investigators to undermine each other. So it was a really poisonous atmosphere inside of the bank. So Trump goes in 2005 to a different division of the bank, and he's looking to build from the ground up a huge skyscraper in downtown Chicago. And Deutsche Bank, after some hemming and hawing, agrees to lend him $640 million to do this. And inside the bank, people are pretty happy about this. It generates a ton of fees for the bank, and Trump obviously will have to pay interest on the loan. So this is very lucrative. And then 3 years later, the financial crisis comes, and Trump once again defaults.
This is 2008.
Yeah, so November 2008, the loan is due, and Trump has the option of either paying it back or not paying it back. And if he doesn't pay it back, there's going to be litigation and the bank will come after him. So he kind of launches a preemptive strike, and he sues Deutsche Bank, accusing the bank of having caused the financial crisis, accuses the bank of having engaged in predatory lending practices against him by trying to collect on the money he owes, and says the loan is void because the financial crisis constitutes this act of God that essentially means the contract is unenforceable. And in an act of chutzpah that I don't think I've ever seen in my career covering this kind of stuff, he seeks $3 billion in damages from the bank, even though he is the one defaulting on the loan, and he's the one who owes them hundreds of millions of dollars. And so Deutsche Bank countersues and seeks – Trump on that loan had personally guaranteed about $40 million of it, which meant that under all circumstances, in any circumstances, Trump needed to pay back at least $40 million to Deutsche Bank, or Deutsche Bank could come after his personal assets. And so this litigation goes back and forth in the courts for a couple of years, and finally in 2010, it gets settled, and Trump agrees to eventually – he's got a year or two to pay back at least the $40 million.
So he doesn't get his $3 billion.
He does not get his $3 billion, which surprises no one, but this, consumed a lot of time and energy within Deutsche Bank, and it was humiliating for them. This was in the public domain. And at this point, Deutsche Bank just completely washes its hands of Donald Trump. They still want their money back, but there's no way they're ever going to touch this guy again. And from Trump's perspective, he, by 2011, 2012, is going to need to have $40 or $50 million to pay back what he still owes Deutsche Bank. And if he wants to continue his career as a real estate developer and keep building golf courses and things like that, he's going to need to find another source of credit. He doesn't want to spend his own money, so he needs to find someone else willing to lend to him. And this is where things get really weird. And Jared Kushner had recently married Ivanka Trump. And Kushner had this relationship with this woman named Rosemary Vrablic, who had recently started at Deutsche Bank. And so Kushner invites Rosemary Vrablic to come by Trump Tower to meet his father-in-law, Donald Trump. And over the course of a couple of months, Rosemary Vrablic and her team at Deutsche Bank agree to reinitiate a relationship with Trump.
Okay, so nobody at Deutsche Bank is saying, hold it, this guy sued us for $3 billion and he has, defaulted on all of his loans.
No, in fact, there's a huge fight inside Deutsche Bank at this point. A lot of people at the bank thought this was a horrible idea. The guy, it's once burned, twice shy. And this is not the first time he'd burned the bank. This is at least the second time. And so there are people who are at a senior level inside the bank who are just apoplectic about the idea of rebooting the relationship with Trump. Why on earth would we do this? But Deutsche Bank, as ever, was extremely hungry for short-term profits. And they thought that reinitiating the Trump relationship, at least in the short term, would generate big fees for this particular division of the bank in which Rosemary Vrablic worked. It was called the private banking division. And Joe Ackerman, the one who is really stomping on the gas pedal trying to wring every last cent out of the business.
This is the CEO from 2002 to 2012.
Yep. And he's in his kind of final days as CEO of the bank, and he gives the green light. And what this means is that the first loan that comes under this new relationship from Deutsche Bank is a $48 million loan that is earmarked specifically for Trump to take that $48 million from Deutsche Bank and use it to repay the other arm of Deutsche Bank on the loan on which he defaulted. And again, that sounds strange. It doesn't make much sense, and you might be trying to understand how on earth does that work? And you know what? You're asking the exact right question because it doesn't make any sense. It's crazy.
All right, so that's 2012, right?
Yep.
Where does it go from there? I mean, he obviously runs for president and wins in 2016, but what happens in the interim?
I mean, this is the beginning of stage 3 of a long, beautiful, very deep financial relationship between Trump and his favorite bank. And over the next few years, Deutsche Bank lends about $350 million to Trump at very low interest rates. It lends tens of millions of dollars to the Kushner family. It loans hundreds of millions of dollars to the Kushner's company. And all of a sudden, Trump goes from being completely unbankable in the Western world to being one of the leading clients of one of the world's largest banks.
And is he good on the money during this period? Is he repaying his loans?
Well, the loans weren't due to be repaid at this point. There were interest payments that were due, and as far as we know, he kept current on those interest payments. What's happened since he took office, though, is it's a complete black box. And we know from his financial disclosure forms that he owed Deutsche Bank about $350 million when he entered office, and that made Deutsche Bank by far his largest creditor. And we don't know if he's kept up on the interest payments. We don't know if he's kept up on principal payments. And we don't have any particular reason to think he hasn't, except for the fact that that is his modus operandi. He defaults on loans just as a matter of course. And for whatever it's worth, Deutsche Bank won't say either way. And there's just not a whole lot of transparency into what's currently going on there.
All right. Well, then that brings me to an obvious question. First, as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, then and currently for the New York Times and writing this book, this is not easy information to get to. It's not exactly made public. I'm assuming that this relationship between Trump and Deutsche Bank isn't the only black box here, but that these other financial transactions and relationships weren't exactly done out in the open. How do you uncover all this as a reporter?
You just spend a lot of time identifying and then building trust with sources. And in general, and not even speaking specifically about Deutsche Bank here, in general, the best way to do that is to find people who have recently left the bank. And the beauty of sourcing at Deutsche Bank and within the Deutsche Bank kind of diaspora is that the place is so dysfunctional and so messed up that virtually everyone at a senior level who left the bank did it with a really bitter taste in their mouth. But Wall Street's a gossipy place, and people, again, in general, want to be out there telling their story so that it's their version of events rather than the rivals. And Deutsche Bank had such a poisonous culture inside that everyone was trying to stab each other in the back. And from a journalist standpoint, that makes my job a lot easier. Okay,
that part may be easier, but there had to have been other challenges writing this book. I mean, what were the biggest challenges for you?
I mean, the biggest challenges were initially finding the right people to talk to. And once I started writing, and we did a bunch of stories last year in the Times, that was kind of a hard decision to make because I felt like I was cannibalizing some of the new material I had for the book. In hindsight, that turned out to work really well because the more we wrote, the more sources came out of the woodwork. And there were – and
it's a little bit like what was happening around the same time with Me Too, where the more we report, the more people come forth.
Yeah, it's just a powerful lesson in the value of publishing the information as you get it rather than stockpiling it and waiting. And there's one point last year where I got a tip from someone through LinkedIn of all places saying that I should pay attention to what was happening in the Jacksonville, Florida compliance offices because there had been some concerns raised about Trump and Kushner transactions down there. And it did not take long to identify the right people to talk to there. And boy, they had quite a story to tell.
Since President Trump has taken office, and even before then, when a book has come out that is unfavorable toward him, he has not hesitated to respond to those books, whether it's on Twitter or in interviews. Has he responded at all to this book, which came out last week?
Not that I know of. And it's been kind of weird. When we wrote some of the big articles last year in the Times, he responded to a couple of those on Twitter. He hasn't responded to the book. And in fact, I went to the White House and to the Trump Organization with this long list of facts and questions and statements that I wanted to check with them and get the response on. And there was no response, and I sent it again and no response. And we did this excerpt for the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago, and the fact checkers from the Times Magazine went to the White House. No response. So it's been radio silence, and I guess there are a number of ways to look at that. I think one possibility is that Trump really is uncomfortable with the Deutsche Bank relationship. I mean, he hasn't trusted the bank with not only being a source of credit for him, but the holder of his financial secrets. They have troves of detailed personal and business financial information about him and his family.
They have much more than we, the American public, have.
Many orders of magnitude more. And they have years and years and years of some of his innermost financial secrets. And the bank there's currently a huge court fight brewing over whether the bank has to disclose those files to congressional investigators that have subpoenaed the bank. But either way, I imagine Trump, who has been fighting tooth and nail since before he was even running for president to keep this stuff secret.
That must be like the brass ring for you as an investigative
Yeah,
reporter.
it's kind of the Rosetta Stone, right? If we get the stuff that Deutsche Bank has, it really unlocks and decodes a lot of what so many reporters and the public, I think, have been clamoring for several years now.
All right. So silence from Donald Trump. What about from Deutsche Bank? Have they responded to the publication of this book?
Yeah, they've said something to the effect of, while elements of this narrative we think are exaggerated, we apologize for our misconduct and agree that we have a lot to learn from our mistakes.
All right. You mentioned early on that it is an anniversary year, a birthday. Happy birthday, Deutsche Bank. What is the status? What is the state of this bank right now in 2020?
Its future, I think, is very much in doubt. And the bank's stock has fallen about 95% from its peak, as the last time I checked. And there are just real existential doubts about where its future is. And the management of the bank, which is relatively new, is scrambling to shrink the bank and kind of retreat to its roots as a primarily German lender and European lender. But they have deep-seated problems, primarily their culture, which still, to this day, remains obsessed on maximizing short-term profits. And it's easy to just kind of pay lip service to the notion of changing that and retreating to your roots. But when you've got an organization with tens of thousands of employees, it's much harder to really change that. And I think it's an open question whether they will succeed.
All right. One last final question, which is that you were reporting on this story for at least 6 years. You've written the book. The story obviously isn't over. Do you continue to report on this, even though this book is out now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree that there's a lot more to be told. And there's a Supreme Court hearing or oral arguments before the Supreme Court next month, a decision in June on whether these documents have to be released. So I think there's a lot more to the story in the months ahead. What's
the unanswered question that you most want answered?
You know, there's been these rumors circulating for years now that Deutsche Bank was, in lending $2 billion to Trump over 20 years, was not really lending its own money, that it was serving as a conduit for Russian banks, state-owned Russian banks that were basically acting on behalf of the Kremlin to funnel money to Donald Trump. And this has been a persistent rumor. There's been a lot of kind of circumstantial evidence and smoke surrounding this, but there's not been any proof or fire. And I have not been able to substantiate the rumors. That does not mean the rumors are not true. And I think the only way that the world will know whether or not that's true is through someone using subpoena power to pry this information out of Deutsche Bank. And luckily enough, there's a lot of stuff that's been subpoenaed right now, and we're waiting to see whether that will become public. And that could definitively answer whether or not this money was lent to Trump on behalf of Russians or if it was just Deutsche Bank's money.
All right. Perhaps your next book. David, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
David Enrich is the author of Dark Towers, Deutsche Bank, Donald Trump, and an Epic Trail of Destruction. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Kiran Millwood Hargrave joins us from Oxford, England. Her new book is called The Mercies. Kiran, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So The Mercies is an adult novel. It is set in 17th century Norway, which is not an obvious time or place for anyone to write about, let alone a British poet and children's book author. So how did you get to this book? What drew you to that time and place?
It really is a case that this book found me. The story very much found me. So I wasn't looking to write a book for adults. I was very happy in my career writing for children. And then I came across an installation by the artist Louise Bourgeois. And her final major installation was on this tiny Arctic Circle island called Vardø in Norway. And it was part of a memorial to these 91 men and women who had been killed. And I just thought it was the most extraordinary thing that I hadn't heard of it. You know, I'd heard of Salem, I'd heard of various ones in the UK, but never ones in Scandinavia. So I instantly started to research, and that's when the story started to grow.
All right. We'll get to those 91 people killed and the witch trials that was the cause of those killings in a moment. But I want to stay with the time and place for a few minutes. If you could give us a sense of what that place was like at that time. I mean, Norway and Denmark were one country. Is that right?
Exactly. They were under the rule of King Christian.
And who were the people in power? And what position also did the Sami people have at that time, the indigenous people?
So it was a really interesting time of change for the country. The Sami people had generally been not accepted, but at least tolerated. Obviously, they were there first, but as King Christian looked for a way to consolidate the power of his church, he saw them as an easy target, an easy way to unite his people behind a common cause. And he started to persecute the Sami people, particularly because they used practices such as wind weaving. Obviously, the weather is an enormous part of life somewhere so far north. And so anyone claiming to have control over it, that used to be quite helpful for sailors and people who were relying on the weather. Then, unfortunately, there was this huge shift away from that as King Christian came to learn of what was going on in Scotland at this time. There were a lot of witch hunts, and Norway, Denmark had a big relationship with Scotland at this time. And King Christian essentially followed suit with King James's rules against witchcraft and sorcery, and took it out specifically on the women of Vardø.
You mentioned that the town where the story takes place is Vardø, which has a kind of interesting, and also the weather. This town is outside the jet stream, right? It's sort of different from the rest of that part of Norway in terms of the kind of weather. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Exactly. It has a very unusual current system, and for that reason, it's always been very good for fishing. It was often free of ice when the rest of that region wasn't. So it became a real trade center for cod fishery, and therefore became a very rich area, even though it was a very uninhabited area, and became of great importance to Norway's wealth. And so Vardø, when you look at it on a map, it's so tiny, so remote, but it's so extraordinary. They built a castle there. They built the most northerly fortress anywhere on earth right on this spot because it was so important as a trading post and as a tactical place to hold power over that region.
What was the Vardø storm that sort of sets into motion your novel?
In 1617, a storm arrived as if loosened from a bag, eyewitnesses said. And it was so sudden, and it was over in a matter of moments. But unfortunately, it happened on Christmas Eve. And in this area, it was traditional to go out on Christmas Eve to catch the Christmas catch, to feed your family on Christmas Day. And so 40 of the men of this island, which would have been most of the men, it would have been all the able-bodied men on this island, were out at the moment this storm arrived. And it was just this cataclysmic event. It was so famous at the time. It sort of was explained as part of this growing witchcraft. As far as Scotland, people were saying that it must have been witches.
You mentioned King James VI of Scotland kind of being a key figure in the rise of witch hunts both in Scotland and in Norway and Finland at the time. That all began with a book, right? Demonology?
Exactly. It was his treatise on how to find, spot, and prove a witch.
So after this storm hits, this huge storm in Vardø, what then happens that kind of triggers this witch hunt?
So in 1617, the same year as the storm, King Christian has finally got his act together, and he's sorted out a complete law against sorcery, against trolldom, which is very closely modelled on the lessons learned by King James in his own mission. So he brings in those laws, but they aren't enacted in Finnmark, in the area where Vardø is, until 1620. And another important thing that happens around this time in Finnmark is that John Cunningham is brought over from Scotland, and he is chosen by King Christian to be the lensman, the lord over this area. And he's served in the Danish Navy, so he's already gone native to a certain extent, but he really digs his heels in and looks for a way to assert his power, with devastating consequences for the women of Varga.
The numbers are pretty staggering, especially when you compare it with, say, the Salem witch trials, which we're familiar with here in the United States. 52 trials, 91 people put to death, 71 of them Norwegian women and 14 Sami men. How did you take all of this history that you're talking about with regard to Varga and these trials and then turn it into a novel?
I think I always knew I didn't want to write a witch trial book. So even though the witch trials are my end point, I was more interested in how you get to that point. I think that felt particularly prescient in these times. How do we get from this huge trauma, which the storm was, to this event of mass hysteria? I was interested in looking at that gap in between. And unfortunately, there wasn't that much, concrete research that I could go to sort of fall back on and really give it a solid grounding. So what I did was, of course, I visited Varga several times, and I also talked extensively with an academic called Dr. Liv Helen Williamson, who is Norway's only expert on these particular witch trials. They are staggering in their scale, and yet even in Norway, they're not talked about. They're not taught in schools. The Salem witch trials are ubiquitous even here in the UK, and in Norway, their equivalent just isn't discussed. So I found that very interesting. The silence around these trials was very interesting to me, and that was something I wanted to write into.
How do you take all of that history again and then jump into fiction? And where do you and how did you turn this into a story that all of your characters are not purely from the historical record? You're coming up with these two central female characters, Maren and Ursa. And how closely did you feel like you needed to stick to that historical record?
I always think truth is often stranger than fiction. So as far as possible, I was interested in being very faithful to the details of how these women would have lived. There are scenes that do focus very much on the domestic, and I just find that so fascinating how our ancestors survived, especially at the edges of the world. But with Maren and Ursa, I took the decision very early on that these were going to be fictional creations. Of course, I read the testimonies of the women who were killed, but I wasn't interested in writing anything that might be seen as disrespectful. These were real lives. And so I wanted to create my own characters that could make this into a compelling work that was also full of hope. Because if I'm being realistic about the way these women lived, it probably was quite bleak the whole way through. And I really wanted to give them some hope, some joy. And that's where the idea of having Ursa, the outsider from Bergen, coming into this community and sort of breaking it apart and giving it some new life, new air. That's when she came to me, when I realized I didn't want it to just be this really claustrophobic narrative. I wanted there to be that light in it.
Tell us a little bit more about Ursa. Who is she and how does she enter into the story?
So Ursa is a ship owner's daughter, and her father has been struggling with his business ever since her mother's death. And he meets a man one day at port called Absalom Cornet. And Absalom Cornet has been hired by John Cunningham to bring the women of Varga to heel, essentially. He's a commissioner. He's been given this huge position of power. And so Ursa's father marries her off to this man who she's never met. And together they go north on this very epic, even nowadays, it's an epic journey from the south of Norway all the way around to the northeasternmost point. And she arrives and literally she's like this explosion in these people's lives. She's this explosion of color. She's plump, which these women never would have seen living as they did off subsistence diet. She's just an exotic creature to them. But even though she looks so soft and so gentle, she's actually got this core of steel. And when she meets Maren, she is able to make Maren, this outwardly very hard person, soft. And together they bring out each other's strengths. And it's a really beautiful friendship.
And tell us about Maren.
So Marin is the first character you'll encounter in the Mercies. She is sitting at her sewing one evening when she feels a change in the air, and she stands and goes to the window and she sees the storm kill her father, her brother, her fiancé, and the other 37 men of her island. So she is a witness to this trauma, and she's an extraordinary person because people react to trauma in all different ways, and some of the women, they react and use their grief and it turns them bitter, it turns them fearful. But Marin remains open-minded, she remains kind, and that makes her the perfect companion for Ursa. They keep their heads while all about them, others are losing theirs.
We talked earlier about the number of people who were killed during this witch hunt, 77 of them Norwegian women, but there were also 14 Sami men. What role did they play and why were they killed?
The Sami men were actually the first to be killed and the last. So all the men who were killed were Sami, and they were all Nawadi, which were shamans, essentially. And they were who the sailors in more tolerant times would have gone to for wind weaving, to have their fates read, to read the runes and bone casting. These were all common practices amongst the Sami men. And so they were the first people that when John Cunningham was given this commission to enact this sorcery decree in Finnmark, they were the first ones that he targeted. And the first two people to die were both Sami men. And then the final person to die was also a Sami man. So they bookended this reign of unprecedented terror that came underneath John Cunningham.
You wrote this against the backdrop of the Me Too movement. And I'm curious if you see parallels between these witch hunts and what's been going on worldwide, primarily in the U.S., but all over in terms of Me Too.
Absolutely. I think there's something about women's anger, women's voices that is incredibly important, and a core idea of this novel is something that really stuck with me during my research were the testimonies of the women and how they really poured out their hearts in these testimonies. And it astounded me. I thought, why are they effectively, in this case, at this time, lying? Why are they saying they're witches, that they did conjure the storm? And the reason is that no one had ever heard them before. No one had ever valued their voices. They had never been given power over men. Men had never feared them before. And I definitely see parallels in terms of the Me Too movement of how finally women's voices do seem to be being listened to, and they're having real world effects. You know, this comes off the back of Weinstein's conviction really recently. And feels like a moment of change. And I'm reserving judgment on how much of an effect this really will have on women's lives. I hope a lot. As a survivor myself, I'm constantly angry, constantly looking for that movement forward. But I'm also cautious. I think that structures, they're so pervasive, and we just have to be ever vigilant and forever moving forward.
I mean, these are themes that children's literature, in particular YA literature, has touched on recently, looking for that hopeful side, which you talked about earlier, of empowerment and giving girls and women voices. Did you think at any point that you would write this as a children's book, or did you know that, no, this is going to be for adults?
It was always going to be for adults. And I really didn't have the time to write this book, but it was very much a case of this story finding me and this story being something that I had to write.
Now that you've written for adults, are you eager to go back to children's books? Your debut was The Girl of Ink and Stars, which won a British Children's Book of the Year, also The Island at the End of Everything. Are you going to go back to children's literature, or do you want to continue in this vein?
I'm going to do both. I've got the bug now. I have to keep going with both. So the children's books, I've got one coming out with Chronicle in October. So I'm keeping that up, but I do have another adult book contracted. So that will be out in a couple of years. So I'm just seeing my career as hopefully switching between the two. I very much admire writers like Margaret Atwood and Philip Pullman, who really switch between genres and are constantly challenging themselves. That's where I'm hoping to work.
All right. Well, double the work for you. But Kiran, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to talk to you.
Kiran Millwood Hargrave's new novel is called The Mercies. Joining us now to talk about what they're reading and reviewing are critics Dwight Garner, Jennifer Salai, and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, Dwight, you are calling us once again from West Virginia, where you're spending a year. What did you review this week?
I reviewed a really interesting memoir by a survivor of the Charlie Hebdo massacre. His name is Philippe Lancon, and he is a critic and novelist who writes for various newspapers and magazines in France. And he was a survivor of that massacre that day on January 7th, 2015, when two gunmen professing allegiance to ISIS came into the Charlie Hebdo offices and basically massacred the entire staff. No one had time to even, he writes, cover their ears before the gunmen were upon them. And he fell to the ground, and as he was falling, was hit by at least 3 bullets himself, some of which tore up his arms. One almost completely tore his jaw off. I mean, almost completely. And part of the story is telling the story of the attack itself, but a large part of the memoir is about his recovery. And it took a very long time. It will be ongoing forever. I mean, they had to take bone out of his leg to reconstruct a jaw. I mean, it's that kind of thing. And it's dark. Bad things happen to people in life, terrible things, but it doesn't always happen to people who are critics and writers and natural word people. And I read in my review, he's a maximalist. There's a truism among writers that, best thing that could happen to a writer is the worst thing that the writer survives, because then you have an obvious good story to tell, right? And often these kind of stories are told in very simple language, because when we have something good to say, we don't need to write language that's all excited about itself. Simple words will suffice, right? And this book, it's told simply, but he is a thinker. And so I read in my review that he takes a lot of goat paths. He pauses to consider all kinds of things, and he's sort of Proustian in a way. And it's not just a little thin memoir. This is almost 500 pages.
Wow, that's a long book.
I know, and he talks about his entire life. And he talks about music and art and caregivers and all kinds of things he packs into this memoir. And it's a little too long. I read in my review. I didn't ever wish it were longer than it is, but it's very well done. And I was very happy to be reading it. I felt very lucky to be reading it. I felt like he'd be paid by my newspaper to read this excellent book and try to write something about it.
Did you feel like it would have been a better book had he stuck to the kind of narrower scope of this was the attack, and this is maybe what preceded the attack at Charlie Hebdo, and written a little bit about his work for that magazine and then the survival? Or do you feel like it worked sort of taking into account his whole life?
Yeah, it would have been a different book for sure. And I can imagine a really tight, hard memoir being published. Yes, I can't imagine that, but I liked his company. And he says some hard things. We all remember those, I don't speak French, but those Je suis Charlie parades in the streets. I am Charlie. The city of Paris was filled with people, demonstrating in favor of Charlie Hebdo. And he writes that it's a bit ironic because on the morning of the day the massacre occurred, Charlie Hebdo was not in good graces with anyone in France. Because they lampooned Islam to some degree, they were seen as racist. People had stopped reading the magazine, and they were making a free speech point, they felt. And they felt that the other magazines and newspapers didn't stand up for Charlie Hebdo, and it sort of put a target on their back. And it's a slightly bitter book as well.
But they were opposed to all organized religions. I mean, they would attack the Catholic Church and... Yes,
they are equal opportunity mockers and haters, and very, very anti-religion and anti-pretension of any sort. Yeah, I mean, I read in my review that, everyone loves The Onion, the American satirical magazine, but compared to Charlie Hebdo, The Onion is playing on the putt-putt mini golf field, Hey, there's a ladybug in my office. Well, spring is coming. This is just great. Anyway.
Dwight, it's February. Spring cannot be coming yet.
It just makes me happy.
Right, that was a little too strong a pivot to a ladybug.
Oh, forgive me. Anyway, the book is Disturbance by Philippe Lancon. And, it has a lot of good things going for it. And it's very French. It's all about art and love and beauty, and even in the face of terrible things. So it's pretty great.
All right, here's another awkward pivot from one workplace book to another, John.
Yeah, I should say I'm here this week in place of Parl Sagel, who couldn't join us, and so I'm going to talk about one of her reviews briefly to give that some credit, because it's a novel that she liked and reviewed this week. It's a novel called Temporary. It's a debut by a woman named Hilary Leichter, Leichter, and it's a fairly short and very imaginative novel. And as Parl says in her review, and this is one of the many things that Parl is good at, which is situating things in the landscape. And she talks about how Elizabeth Hardwick, the great critic, and Vivian Gornick, another great critic, in the 70s and 80s respectively talked about how novels about sex and then novels about sort of love and marriage had not gone the way of the dodo bird, but they don't really give us what we need because we don't really believe in them anymore. That we know that, self-actualization doesn't really come from these institutions. And Parle says that a lot of these same effects can now be seen in novels about work and the workplace. And that's where we sort of look for our, I don't know whether you would call them, not coming of age stories, but again, self-actualization. And so this is kind of a fantastical novel about a young woman who's a temp worker who goes through, I think, more than 20 jobs. She's on a pirate ship, I think, at one point in the severance department. And as one character jokes, any limb will do. And Parle says that it has, I'm going to quote her here just because she's obviously more eloquent on it than I am. And the book is somewhat fragmented. They go through these jobs fairly quickly.
Fragmented is like going to become a triggering word here on the podcast.
It already is, yeah.
All right, do go on.
And she has 18 boyfriends, I think. So there's a lot of just, obviously, it's somewhat parodic in nature. But Parle writes, in these snippets, you can hear an old note, a note I've missed in American fiction and am surprised to have noticed myself missing. For so long, it seemed dominant to the point of imperishability. The violent, surreal, often cartoonish scenarios delivered deadpan that draw attention to the freakishness of ordinary life from writers like Donald Barthelme, Gordon Lish, Ben Marcus. And I think actually she doesn't mention this book, but in reading this review and in looking at the book while I was working on it with her, I was reminded a little bit of George Saunders's earlier like Civil War Land in Bad Decline, that kind of social commentary but delivered in this very cartoonish, often entertaining way.
I'm going to make another awkward pivot because speaking of fragments, that's the structure a little bit of the book that you reviewed.
Yes. Jen. Actually, it is the structure of the book that I reviewed, which
I was trying not to upset anyone.
No, that's fair. So I reviewed this week The Power Notebooks by Katie Roiphe. And Katie Roiphe, as some or many of our listeners might know, is well known for her polemical essays, which I actually think are probably the weakest aspects of her work. She also wrote a book more recently about the end of life of famous writers. She's also written about famous relationships. She, came onto the scene, I guess, in the early 90s when she wrote a book called The Morning After, in which she said that she wanted to argue against what she called, I think, the feminist preoccupation with sexual harassment and abuse on campus. And so, she's sort of become...
That's like not a book that you're going to see an anniversary edition of.
Well, I mean, it's interesting.
Current moment.
She also did write an essay for Harper's a couple of years ago about Me Too, asking whether the Me Too movement has already gone too far. And so, she's really known for these controversial, I guess, sort of bomb-throwing essays. In this book, she writes that she wanted to try something different, that she wanted to explore things like ambivalence and vulnerability, which she was really, really careful to keep at bay in her previous work. And so she tells this story in fragments in this sort of diaristic form that I think we've all talked about many times on the podcast in different books. And I think Dwight made a really great point when he was reviewing another book that was also told in fragments, which is that this kind of form can really highlight a writer's weaknesses. And I think in the case of Roiphe, I mean, she's actually a really skillful writer, I think, on the level of the sentence. I think you read her, and there's something really mesmerizing, even in this book, that doesn't have sort of an obvious structure. But there's also something kind of evasive about it. And one of the things that she says that she really wants to explore is women being vulnerable in their relationships with men. So already she's returning to a territory that she's already shown an interest in the past. And that's something she gives a lot of space to. And then when she explores her relationships with other women, it gets a little bit flat, a little bit cartoonish. So it's interesting because I think that there's a couple ways to read this book, which is one, the way that she explains it, which is she wants to explore vulnerability and ambivalence, and so she's going to do it. So there's a little bit more of that in this book than you'll see in her other books.
Do you think that she's more comfortable as a literary critic and a cultural critic than she is as a kind of personal essayist?
In terms of comfort, I don't know, because I think that there's a way in which, her polemical works, as I've said, work against what I think is her main strengths as a writer. So I'm not sure if that comes from comfort or just sort of a sense that she's speaking a truth that nobody else will speak. And, we should also say that she's the daughter of Anne Roiphe, the feminist who, even when Katie Roiphe came out with her book in the early 90s, she was saying that she was arguing against, in a way, the sort of position that people like her mother was taking in the 70s. And so Roiphe wanted to move away what she called, I think, a kind of victim feminism or a fixation on victimhood. And so in this book, it's interesting because she really does open up in terms of her own experience as somebody who she does say at one point, was kind of a victim. I mean, she doesn't want to own the label outright, but she does accept that even if she wasn't, quote unquote, wholly a victim, that doesn't mean that she wasn't also kind of a victim in certain relationships with men.
Jen, can I ask you a question about this book? I read a lot of this book. One of the issues she picks up that interested me, and she talks about it in terms of women, but I think it applies to men quite often as well. In terms of victimization, she writes about how, with the possible exception of Joan Didion and Janet Malcolm, so many young writers these days, journalists mostly, are so hyper aware of their privilege that they sort of want to prove that they too are somehow victims. They're messed up. They apologize. They approach their subjects from this sort of low angle that I'm damaged too. And I've seen this in some recent books, and I've sometimes thought to myself, you don't have to do that. Why are you telling me these stories? I want good writing to be good writing sometimes, or always. But I'm curious to know what you made of this issue which she picks up.
Yeah, it was so interesting because there is that whole chapter devoted to it in the Power Notebooks where she calls it, the I am relatable moment in these books, or I am a mess, I think is another way that she puts it, which is also interesting coming from her because she had a whole book, I think, 6 or 7 years ago called In Praise of Messy Lives. So there's a way in which she herself, I think, has already had a complicated relationship to vulnerability and victimhood. I mean, I do think that there is a way in which the kind of writing she doesn't like, she criticizes it for, I think, strenuously appearing to be relatable, which I think is sort of an interesting criticism because insinuated in that is the notion that these women aren't necessarily searching for a deeper truth, that they're doing something to try to appeal to their readers that might be, she doesn't say it, but the implication I got from it was that there was a little bit of cynicism in it. And so it was interesting to read that part and then to go through the entire book and think, well, is that what this book is? I mean,
I felt the same way.
I don't want to criticize her for being too cynical, but at the same time, she herself sort of sets up the whole conversation in those terms. Did you feel that way, Dwight, when you were reading it?
Absolutely. I will say in defense of Katie Roiphe, and I have mixed feelings about Katie's work. I reviewed one of her last books positively. I think she's a really striking writer, and I don't always agree with what Katie has to say, but I'm always interested in it. And she has many, many critics, and most of those critics I'm just less interested in reading, not because I don't agree with their takes on Katie, but someone said that the mark of someone who's a serious human being is that you're interested in what they have to say, even if you really disagree with it. And I will say that Katie, for me, when I see her byline, I'm going to read that piece. And not just because she's a troll, let's say, trying to pull reactions from us. I think that she's trying to work things out, and she's an unusual specimen of humanity and has interesting things to say, even if I don't agree with them.
I'm going to wrap up here with a question from one of our listeners, and it's a question that we've gotten in some variation before, but I'm going to ask it again on behalf of this listener, whose name is Tim Boomer, because it's a question that I always want the answer to as well. And he writes, every week I feel a twinge of envy as I listen to the discussion of what you all are reading. Knowing that your day jobs are at least as busy as the rest of us, you seem to manage to read 1 or 2 books a week on top of the books you are specifically reading to write a review. How do you do it? How fast do you read? Do you skip, skim, abandon? Do you read in the office? Can you grab a page or 2 in the odd moments waiting in line or riding the subway? Or do you block out periods of undistracted private time? I don't even know what that is, by the way.
Yeah, what would that mean?
That's like foreign. Okay, to continue. And you remember what you read. Quote, this book reminds me of a little-known 19th century gem, as well as the early work of Theodore Dreiser, unquote. I think that's directed at you, John. Do you take notes on your pleasure reading? I can't remember the name of the main character of a book I read a month ago. All right, so that's a number of questions. I am going to just co-sign with Tim Boomer on that last, not remembering the name of the main character of a book I read a month ago. But let's send it over to you, Jen.
Well, I have to say, I mean, in terms of remembering, I have a hard time with that unless I actually take notes, which sometimes I do with my pleasure reading when I get some in. But, often in terms of my weekly routine, I mean, depending on the week, if I'm reviewing something that requires a lot of background reading, which often is the case with some of these nonfiction books, I mean, I'm just sort of casting about with different things. Some books are more pleasurable than others.
Are you a fast reader?
You know, I wish I could say I was, but I don't think I am. I'm not like Harold Bloom, who apparently could just like turn the pages and inhale whatever was on the page.
That's John also.
I mean, I do some, you know, when we decide what we review, I mean, we do skim a lot. We look at a lot of the books that are coming in. And so there is a lot of skimming on that end just to see if something speaks to us.
Skimming and abandoning. But, you know, if I really want to understand a book, I mean, you just have to immerse yourself in it. But then if you're also doing something for research or consulting something that's relevant to the thing that you're reviewing, you can also sort of dip into it in a different way.
Dwight, you take a lot of notes in your pleasure reading, don't you?
Yeah, I've been a massive note taker my entire life. As a matter of fact, you all know this, but I have a book coming out this fall.
That was my cue to your advertisement, actually, Dwight.
I'm publishing a sort of what's known as a commonplace book, which is a collection of some of my favorite quotations. And mine is kind of different in a lot of ways, which I won't get into now. But I've kept a commonplace book since I was in high school, I think, just writing down favorite sentences and words and paragraphs. And over time, I've sort of organized it. So I look at it sometimes. And if I'm trying to think of a book I read, a travel book, and this idea that comes to my mind, I have this section in my notes just about travel and travel literature, and I'll go there and, oh, yes, that was the book, and he talked about Y, or X. So it's useful to me. I'll say about reading that, I told my kids when they were pretty young, I said, ABC, always be carrying, I said, you guys, if you're on the subway or on a train or on an airplane and you're looking at your phone, what a waste. You can look at your phone all the time. Like, have a book, for Christ's sakes, and it didn't sink in with both of them out entirely. But, it's those little moments at the DMV or waiting for your dentist, or, if you have a book with you, you can get quite a lot of reading done rather than looking at the old issue of, Country Living or whatever, sitting in the waiting room.
But are you a fast reader?
I don't think so. I read, I like to say that the average person can read the average book in about 8 hours. And now, if you have a full-time job and you only read half an hour a day, that's going to take you almost a month to finish that book. But if you're like Jen and like me and like the two of you, we can read that in one day if we have to, because that's our job,
Speak for yourself, Dwight.
Well, 40 pages, you can time it out. 40 pages, I think, is high to average. Maybe sometimes 50 pages, depending on, the typeface and all of that.
Wait, per hour?
All right,
it really depends on the typeface.
Okay. Here's where we segue to John.
Well, I think my reputation is inflated here a little bit. I read a lot, but unlike the three other people on this podcast, I don't have children. I don't have to carve out time for reading. I can do it pretty much whenever I want. And I spend a lot of my weekends and my nights reading. And I read fairly quickly.
This is really upsetting.
I know, I'm sorry. I don't speed read, but I do. The more I'm enjoying something, the slower I like to go, because it is true that the faster I go, the less I probably absorb and retain. But it also does depend on the typeface. I mean, I'm reading a lot of times when you read like a 300-page novel that has, like Dwight saying, a typeface that isn't minute, I can get through that pretty quick, like in a couple of days if I'm really sitting down and reading it. But then, some 600-page biography of a politician with tiny type, it's going to take me a fairly long time, like anybody else. So it kind of comes and goes. But I'd say I can average a couple of books a week if I don't have anything else going on.
It's funny. I think I've said this before on this podcast, but having the job that Jen and I do, it's weird. So your time sort of accordions, because some weeks I'll review a book of poems. Maybe it's the first book of poems, and you can read a book of poetry pretty damn quickly. You can read it 3 times in an afternoon or 4 times. Other weeks I'll be reviewing a 600-page novel by a novelist whom I've never read before, who has 2 previous 600-page novels, and I feel compelled to go read those first. And that week can be just trying to have 8 Thanksgiving meals, one after another. And so it's weird how time expands and contracts when you do this for a living.
I think that now is a good time to end with the fact that Parl Sagel is probably home right now doing exactly that, as she is reading and reviewing Hilary Mantel's third installment of the Thomas Cromwell trilogy.
That's where she is. She's home force-feeding Hilary Mantel?
Yes.
Oh, wow. I can't wait to read her on that.
Coming soon. All right, Dwight, Jen, John, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.